Today is October 1st, and we're covering section 2.4, which is multiply real numbers. We're actually going to multiply and divide real numbers today, and mainly, like it says right underneath there too, we're really just going to concentrate on multiplying and dividing integers. When we have decimal numbers and some other types of numbers too in this section, I will let you use your calculator, but I'm going to talk about some strategies where if you don't have your calculator, there still should be some things you can figure out when you're multiplying and dividing integers together. Two things I'd like to note right away is before we jump into this section, and I'd like you to write down here in red, is we just worked on adding and subtracting integers, and when we were doing that, there was entirely different rules for adding and subtracting integers. We even talked about those strategies when I'm adding two integers together. If there's positive and negative numbers, we talked about one thing you can do is think about money. If it's a negative number, it's like money you owe. If it's a positive number, it's money you have. Or we talked about kind of a mental math way to do those problems, or we even talked about using a number line. Okay. Well, those were all great strategies for adding and subtracting integers, but now we're multiplying and dividing, and this has its own separate set of rules. So something we'll have to keep an eye on and kind of keep separate in our brain, that multiplying and dividing, different rules than adding and subtracting. Also something to note that when we're talking about adding, or when we're talking about multiplying and dividing numbers, the signs, whether they're positive or negative on the numbers, don't affect the numbers themselves at all. And what I mean by that is when you multiply two numbers together, whether they're positive or negative or not, the number answer is still going to be the same. Like 2 times 6 is always going to be 12, no matter what. And 7 times 5 is always going to be 35. If we add some negatives to that problem, the answer may become positive or negative, but it doesn't change the fact that those numbers multiplied together always give us the same number for a result. And I'll kind of show that with some examples up here as we go along. I've got 3 problems up here to start off. This first one actually I put up here, actually these first 2, because I kind of want to compare them to each other, and hopefully you realize the difference between these 2 problems. Number 1 says -5 minus -20. And so first I just want us to realize that this one is a subtraction problem. This is like we did the last section. This is something I would chop and actually turn into -5 plus 20 to find the answer. And then like we talked about with our strategies from last section, we could talk about -5 is like I owe somebody $5. I have 20 myself. So I could pay off my debt. How much would I have left? I'd have $15 left. So again, that's an adding strategy or an adding and subtracting strategy. That's how I do that kind of problem. Number 2, though, this is now a multiplying problem. There's no subtraction sign in here, okay, like there was with this problem. There's a subtraction sign in there that we changed. But in this problem, the -5 is right next to the -20 in parentheses. So this means I'm going to multiply. When I multiply, like it says above here, the signs do not affect what the number is going to be at all. So if I even just ignore the negative signs for a second and just say that this is 5 times 20, well, that's always going to be 100, no matter what, no matter which of these signs will be negative or positive. In this case, the fact that both signs are negative, that means I'm going to get a positive answer. And sometimes you'll see me put that up next to the problem number there just to remind myself before I even go through. I could tell this is a positive number for the answer because it's 2 negatives that are multiplied together. I know the answer is going to be positive. In this case, it ends up being 100. But just know that 5 times 20, no matter where the negatives are in that problem, is always going to give me 100. I just got to determine if it's going to be a positive or negative answer for that problem. Same thing with number 3 here. Okay, if I just kind of ignore this negative on the 50 for a second, I can even just look at the number and say 100 divided by 50. Well, that's always going to be 2, no matter what. But when I look at the signs now, it's 100 divided by -50. We'll learn here in a second that a positive divided by a negative is always going to give me a negative answer. And 100 divided by 50 gives me 2, so this actually ends up being -2. Just kind of know that those things work independently. The sign from what my answer is going to be and the numbers. So by looking at a problem, you should be able to tell me even right off the bat what the sign is going to be. Even do that part first. Below here I've got a little cheat sheet. At least I call it a cheat sheet for how to multiply 2 numbers together when you're talking about positives and negatives. So this is something I would like you to write down. It says cheat sheet for multiplying or dividing 2 numbers. And what you notice here is the top one and the very bottom one. How you read this chart first I should start off with. Like this is saying that if you have a positive and you multiply another positive to it, you get a positive for an answer. That's all it's saying. Not necessarily what numbers in particular, but that's just saying what type of number. If you're multiplying positive times a positive, you get a positive answer. If you're multiplying a positive times a negative, you're going to get a negative answer. okay, and so on through the chart. That's how you read that. One thing I'd like you to notice is that whenever you have two signs that are the same, that's going to yield a positive answer. So like that top one, you've known for a long time. If I have a positive times a positive, it gives me a positive answer. Also notice the very bottom one. This one says that a negative times a negative gives me a positive answer. Just like in problem number 2 like we had up here. When I multiplied negative 5 times negative 20, that gave me a positive answer, positive 100. So when I'm multiplying numbers, you can kind of group it like this, actually, the ones in blue. If I have the two signs are the same for the numbers I'm multiplying, that's going to yield a positive answer. The middle ones here say, well, if I have two signs that are different, then I'm going to get a negative answer, no matter which order they're in. Now looking at a few examples together, here's what I would even like you to do in some of the homework problems, is again, I'm going to let you use your calculator for this section and on the quiz. That won't be a problem, but I would still like you to be able to analyze a problem and tell me, should the answer be positive or negative? So if I look at number 1 there, it says 6 times negative 40. Either by memorizing that cheat sheet or some other method that you have, I'd like you to be able to memorize or know that looking at that problem, right away I can tell my answer is going to be a negative answer because there's one negative in this problem, or it's just a positive times a negative. And so you could at least write that part down if nothing else. If you have to use the calculator to help you with the numbers, that's fine. But you should be able to know that this is going to be a negative for an answer. And 6 times 40 is going to be 240. So I just know it's negative 240. Problem number 2. It says negative 2 times negative 15. If I'm multiplying a negative times a negative, I'm going to get a positive for an answer no matter what the numbers tell me. So right away you say, okay, that's going to be a positive answer, and kind of note that to yourself. 2 times 15 is always going to be 30. And like I said, this one's positive, so it's just positive 30. Number 3, even when we're dividing, the same rules apply. So it says 80 divided by negative 4. Again, you should be able to tell me right away, oh, it's a positive divided by a negative. Since the signs are different, I'm going to get a negative for an answer. And then 80 divided by 4 is always going to be 20 no matter what. So in this case, it's just negative 20. And that last one, a negative divided by a negative, gives me a positive. So my answer is going to be positive no matter what. 20 divided by 10 is 2. So my answer is positive 2. Well, these rules work pretty good if there's only two numbers involved when I'm dividing or multiplying. But what if we're multiplying a bunch of numbers, like 3 or 4 or 5 or more numbers than just the 2? Well, there is something we can do to figure out also for these problems what the answer is going to be. Should it be positive or negative? And I'll just go through a couple of these examples here. There's two methods I would talk about for doing this. You could just kind of go two numbers at a time, as if you were just multiplying two numbers, see what the result would give you, and then multiply to the next one and see what that would give you. So for example, number 5 here, if I'm looking at this problem, I could say negative 2 times negative 4. Well, what does that give me? That would give me a negative times a negative, which would be a positive answer. So I don't know what that number is yet, but I know it would be positive for an answer for sure. And then if I took a positive times a negative, what would I get? I'd get a negative for an answer. So I could say that number 5 would be a negative, just kind of working through the problem there. Without actually doing the numbers, I can work through the signs and figure out it should be a negative answer. Then if I come back and look at the numbers, well, I could say negative 2 times negative 4 give me 8, times negative 3 would give me negative 24. And again, that checks out because I saw that my answer should have been negative in the first place, so that does work. Same thing with number 6 here. I could just work it out two numbers at a time. Okay, I could even kind of group them. Since I'm multiplying all these numbers together, I could even just kind of pair them like this and say, well, the first two, 5 times negative 2 is going to give me a negative answer, and negative 1 times 6 is going to give me a negative answer. And I know a negative times a negative will be a positive, so I can actually just kind of group them like that and say I know that this is going to be a positive answer no matter what. 5 times 2 is 10, times 1 gives me 10 also, times 6 gives me 60. So I know this answer's got to be positive 60. So you can kind of work problems out like that where you just go two numbers at a time and keep working through. Even without doing the numbers, you could see what the answer's got to be. There's also another way you could do this too, though. Kind of a special rule. If I'm multiplying a bunch of things together, or even dividing, if I'm multiplying a bunch of numbers together, more often this is when you'll use it. You can also just count up the number of negatives that appear in the problem, and that can tell you if your answer should be positive or negative. So in this problem number 7 right here, I actually see that I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. I have 3 negatives, and you'll find out, as I'll show you in the next page too, some we could figure out by doing some problems, that if you have an odd number of negatives, what's going to happen is you're going to get a negative answer. Because when all the negatives pair up, as you can see that when you multiply 2 negatives together, they pair up and make a positive. Well, if you have an odd number of negatives, that means there's going to be one left over after, like I would pair up these first two here, -3 and -12. I pair these up, this will give me a negative, okay? Or as I said, this will give me a positive. But then I'll have over here this -1. -1 times 2 will give me a negative. And I'll still end up with that last negative in the problem because it's left off. It doesn't have another negative to pair itself with. So when you have an odd number of negatives, you'll find out that the answer will always be a negative answer too. 3 times 12 would be 36, times 2 would be 72, so this would be negative 72 for an answer. Okay. But again, that's how you can kind of figure out if it should be a positive or negative number. Same thing with number 8. Okay, I could kind of go 2 by 2 with all these numbers. But if I just count how many negatives are in the problem, that'll tell me itself that this answer should be positive or negative. In this case, it's just a bunch of -1s multiplied together. But how many are there? Well, if I look, it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 -1s all multiplied together. So that means there's 8 negatives. If there's an even number of negatives in this case, there's 8 negative numbers, even number of negatives, that tells me it's going to be a positive answer. Because what's going to happen is all of these are going to pair up and make a positive. If I multiply these together, I'll get a positive. And these two a positive, and these two a positive, and these two a positive. And if I multiply all these positives together, of course I'll get a positive answer. So the answer to this one would just be +1. Because there's 8 different -1s multiplied together, that means there's 8 negatives. And so that tells me it's going to be a positive answer. So on this next page, I have that rule up here. It says if we just count the number of negatives in a problem, that will also tell us what the sign of the answer should be. If it's an odd number of negatives, then my answer is going to be negative. If there's an even number of negatives, then my answer is going to be a positive answer, just like we showed on those problems on the previous page. So again, even showing that off here on the last 4 examples that I have on the board. So this number 1 here, I have 2 negatives, it looks like, 2 negative signs. So that tells me if there's an even number of negatives, I should have a positive answer. Now I'll just kind of work through the problem just to prove that that's right. If I had 6 times -4, this would be -24 times -2. Well, negative times a negative will give me a positive. So yep, that makes sense that this should be +48. So it can be kind of like a check for yourself. Or again, it can tell you what the answer is going to be, and then you can just work through the numbers too. Number 2, I see that I have a negative times a negative here, and a negative times a negative here. Both these would give me positives. And then that would obviously give me a positive for an answer. Okay, that's one way I could do it. Or again, looking at the top of the page here, I can see that I have 4 negative signs. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's an even number of negatives. So that tells me I should get a positive for an answer. 2 times 15 gives me 30. Times 1 is still 30. Times 4 gives me 120. Looking at these last 2 problems, I'll use the rule from above on these last 2. If I count the number of negatives, that should tell me what my answer should be, positive or negative. So if I look at number 3 here, I can see I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. That's an odd number, so my answer should be negative. 2 times 1 should be 2, times 2 again would still be 4, times 1, either way, that's still just going to be 4, so it should be negative, because I found out earlier my answer was negative, -4. And then my last problem up here, I just see that there's 1 negative right there on the last number, so that means my answer should be negative. And as I multiply the numbers out, 1 times 4 gives me 4, times 5 gives me 20, times 2 gives me 40, and I figured out my answer should be negative, so -4. One thing I noticed as I was going through the problems there are actually, you can see there's a few ways you could do these problems. You could just go 2 at a time and kind of group the numbers like I did in number 2 here. I just kind of grouped them. Or again, you can, like I did on the other ones, I can look at that rule from above and say, oh, I can just count the number of negatives in the problem. So that's one thing that can be a little tricky for people, is there's a couple ways you can do the problem. But what I would do is pick a way that you like, either count up the negatives all the time, or maybe even just go 2 at a time, like I did in problem number 2 there. Whatever works for you, but just find a way you're comfortable with that you know you can get the right answer, and stick with that method. So pick one that you're strong with, and that's the way you should do the problems.